Greetings and welcome to Chapter 5, Civil Rights. Now, previously, we looked at limitations placed on government regarding civil liberties. And now we're going to be diving into civil rights. We're going to be looking at its definition. We're going to be taking a look at some legislation that was passed at the state level that violated civil rights. We're going to be taking a look at some legislation that was passed at the national level that tried to protect civil rights. So with that said, let's get into this. But before we do, I want to take a moment real quick to address a particular topic. I'm going to be using the term race in this chapter, but I want to give you some thoughts, my thoughts on this particular issue before getting into this. And very simply put, unless we're talking about zoo animals, there is one race. It's human. Now, true, are there differences among us? Absolutely. But those differences do not define our humanity, our physical characteristics, things that are outside of our control, like the pigment, for example, of my skin. I can't control that. That does not define my humanity, right? The idea of race somehow implies, to me at least, that there is one that might be superior than the other, which I outright reject. That somehow that there is a race, pun intended, that one is trying to be better than the other. I outright reject those two notions, okay? So when we're talking about race, there's only one. It's the human race, period, right? So I think a better term to use is ethnicity as a way to describe differences that are among us. But I don't believe race is the best term to use. Again, because it implies somehow one's better than the other. And I outright reject that notion. But it is a construct that you are perhaps more familiar with, at least this term. So we're going to be using that. But just note when I say race, I really truly mean ethnicity, as a way to denote differences, physical differences that we have. But I am not somehow implying that one's superior than the other. So I just want to lay that foundation down real quick, give you my thoughts on that before we dive into this. Now, all that said, let's get into civil rights. So, definition. Civil rights are equal protections from discrimination under the law, regardless of race, religion, or any other personal characteristic for which we may possess. Right? Equal protections from discrimination under the law. In other words, equal treatment by government authorities. Right? If someone who is white or black or Hispanic or Asian that's pulled over, there is an expectation that all four will be treated equally, right? Now, is that the case? Do we observe that today, right? You might be able to point to certain news stories that we've heard here of recent times. You might be able to reflect on your own personal experiences that you have, but it's a good analytical question. Is everyone truly being treated equally under the law? It's a good question. So that said, what are equal protections? So equal protection is a provision that's found within the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that requires states to treat all residents equally under the law. Unfortunately, we're going to see that has not always been the case. That the government has not always treated everyone equally. So, some equal protection issues. right? We have de facto segregation. This is segregation that results from the private choices of individuals, people who are choosing to segregate willingly on their own, right? So choosing to be with one group and not with another, right? This is de facto segregation. De jure segregation is segregation that results from government discrimination. So some examples of this would be the Black Codes, which were laws passed immediately after the Civil War that discriminated against freed slaves and other blacks and deprived them of their rights, of their civil rights. Now, what's interesting to know about Black Codes is that they were written in such a way that it was broad enough that it was going to be applied to everyone, regardless of your ethnicity. However, the implementation, the execution, the prosecution was only at those who were black. Right? So it was written, the law was written in such a way, these codes, these laws were written in such a way that it was broad enough, it seemed like it was going to be applied to everyone. But in terms of enforcing them, they were only enforced on those who were black. So do we really have equal treatment with black codes? No. Other forms of segregation, we have Jim Crow laws. Right? Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that promoted racial segregation and undermined black voting rights in the South after Reconstruction. Now, there are two thoughts that I want to talk about here real quick. The first is Reconstruction. Well, more accurately, the Civil War. We'll get into examples of Jim Crow laws here in just a moment. That's the other point I want to talk about. But I want to talk about the Civil War. Right? If I were to ask you, who fought during the Civil War, you would probably most likely answer with the North and the South. Fantastic. You're absolutely correct. But let's be more specific. Who fought one another? Well, it's the Union versus the Confederacy. Okay, perfect. You're right. Absolutely. But let's go a little bit further than that. The Union. Union of what? The United States. The Union was the United States government, which is established by the U.S. Constitution. The Confederacy. Remember back when we talked about Confederacy in a previous video, the Confederacy was a rebellion of the southern states against the United States government, against the U.S. Constitution. So let me be very, very clear here what I'm trying to get at. The Civil War was a fight between a rebellion South against the United States government. Just want to point that out. So what is Reconstruction? Reconstruction is the time immediately after the Civil War. It was a way to rebuild politically and physically, rebuild the South from the devastation and the destruction of the Civil War. So there were policies that were implemented that were trying to ensure that the South was compliant with civil rights, with not stripping away the rights of blacks and other minorities. So that's Reconstruction. There was a huge push from the South that rejected this, that outright saw Reconstruction as the federal government overstepping its bounds. But again, who won the Civil War? It wasn't the rebellion, it was the Union, i.e. the United States government. So that's interesting, just to note that real quick. The other note here is examples of Jim Crow laws. Okay, and there are 5 that I want to talk about. 5. I want to mention these. and how horrific and how bad these laws were that were passed at the state level. I want to take a real quick second to say that I am about to quote these Jim Crow laws, and by no means is this a reflection of what I think. Right? These are absolutely horrific. One example of Jim Crow laws in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1930. Quote, and I'm quoting here, quote, marriages are void when one party is a white person and the other is possessed of 1/8 or more Negro, Japanese, or Chinese blood. In Nebraska, 1911, separate free schools shall be established for education of children of African descent, and it shall be unlawful for any child to attend any white school or any white child to attend a colored school. In 1929, Missouri, quote, all railroads carrying passengers in the state, other than street railroads, shall provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races by providing 2 or more passenger cars for each passenger train, or by dividing the cars by a partition so as to secure separate accommodations. This second to last one. This one's from Mississippi. I don't know the year that this was passed, but bear with me here real quick. And I quote, the marriage of a white person with a Negro or person who shall have 1/8 or more of Negro blood shall be unlawful and void. These are just 4 examples of Jim Crow laws. The 5th one, we're going to be diving into this one a little bit more. There were laws that were passed at the state level here in the South that only white people could vote in the primaries. We will talk more in depth about that here in just a second, but just note this was a Jim Crow law. That white-only primaries was in fact an example of a Jim Crow law. So those are the 5 that I wanted to mention here. So obviously these are horrific, right? Obviously. These were laws passed at the state level that did result in the violation of civil rights, of the civil rights of blacks and other minorities. So we need to take a moment here real fast and discuss how important state elections are. We have to know what our elected officials, what our candidates, and what our nominees, what they are thinking, what policies they want to pursue, what do they say in public, what do they say, what is their, how do they view issues, and then you and I, according to your ideology, according to my own ideology, we should judge them and vote accordingly. If what they say matches with what you believe, vote for them. If what you hear violates what you believe, vote against them. Communicate that thought to them. Let them know of your disapproval. I mean, after all, they are elected to serve you, right? You're elected representatives, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level. Their job is to hear from you and I. So let them know. Let them know, indeed. Because, again, that's their job, right? Their job is to hear from you and I. It is to represent you and I. And if they don't hear from us to know how to represent you and I, they can't do their job. So I want to make that note. So elections are extremely important because we give our consent to be governed through the ballot box, through that vote. When we cast that vote, we are saying, yes, I agree with that position. Yes, I agree with what you're saying. Or if we vote against them, we are saying, I am removing my consent. I do not support this whatsoever. Right, so voting is extremely important because it is our way to give consent. But I digress. Let's get back to civil rights. Some important equal protection cases. Plessy v. Ferguson. This is the 1996 Supreme Court ruling that allowed separate but equal racial segregation under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We should note that years later, in 1954, Plessy v. Ferguson, which is considered one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has historically made, it struck it down. It struck down Plessy v. Ferguson. And it declared segregation and separate but equal to be unconstitutional in public education. So Brown v. Board of Education struck down what happened with the ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson. So that's what we need to note here. Other important civil rights laws that we need to be familiar with is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This outlaws segregation and other forms of discrimination by most businesses that were open to the public, including hotels, theaters, restaurants that were not private clubs. So there was this argument that, well, as long as it's private, as long as it's not public institution of any kind, then we can do what we want. Well, not quite. That's what this law would allow, right? As long as it was a private. The law also created, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, to monitor employment discrimination claims and help enforce this particular provision of the Civil Rights Act. Continuing on with this important civil rights laws that were passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which outlawed racial and gender discrimination in the sale, rental, or financing of housing. This was signed into law, of course, by Lyndon B. Johnson. Affirmative action. Real quick, I want to mention this real fast. We should remember that JFK, President John F. Kennedy, he was elected, and he only served 2 years of his first term. And one of his agenda items was affirmative action and other civil rights priorities. Due to his assassination, unfortunately, he couldn't see the fruition of these efforts in his agenda that he had, that he wanted to push through Congress, that he lobbied Congress for his first 2 years. So when Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, then later became President Lyndon B. Johnson, when he became president, he made sure he pushed these civil rights agenda items through the legislature, through the U.S. Congress, almost on behalf of JFK to see it through. So it's interesting to note that, right? We'll talk more about the importance of vice presidents in another chapter video, but I just want to note that here. Anyways, so affirmative action. It is the use of programs and policies designed to assist groups that have historically been subjected to discrimination, right? So we had to pass laws to ensure that groups have been subjected to discrimination will no longer suffer that, right? Will no longer in hiring. So specific discrimination that affirmative action addresses is that in hiring processes, college admissions. Yes, even admission into college, there was a component of discrimination based upon your ethnicity, based upon to use that term based upon your race, and other minority-owned businesses. So getting loans was extremely difficult if you were black or if you were other minority. So affirmative action tried and help address those forms of discrimination. Disenfranchisement. This term we often hear quite a bit, it seems, especially during election season. And the reason for that is what it is. Disenfranchisement is the revocation or the removal, the denial of someone's right to vote. That's what disenfranchisement is. It is denying someone, revoking, taking away someone's right to vote. That's disenfranchisement. As we're seeing more and more states passing tighter voting laws, we will hear this term disenfranchisement more and more as those who oppose these strict state laws, they will argue. They will argue that point of its disenfranchisement, which begs the question, what do you think? As states crack down on voter fraud and passing these more restrictive voting laws, do you think this is an attempt to squash or to hinder someone's right to vote? Or is it simply trying to protect the ballot box? Is it trying to protect our vote? What's interesting to note, though, is take a look at the percentage of voter fraud. How frequent does voter fraud happen? How much voter fraud is there? It's a good question. You might be surprised at the answer, but that's a good discussion. But anyways, disenfranchisement, right? So we have examples of laws that were passed, Jim Crow laws. Remember I was referring to the white-only primary? Well, here we go. But the white-only primary is a primary election in which only whites are allowed to vote. Now, this practice, white-only primaries, was abolished, was taken care of, was struck down in the case of Smith v. Allwright in 1944. So, a black man walked in to the Democrat primary here in Texas, here in Houston, actually, and he was denied the right to vote in the primary. The Democrats, yes, I said it right, Democrats. We're going to talk about the evolution of the Republican Party and the Democrat Party later. Just note right now that, yes, in fact, it was the Texas Democrats, the same Democrat, the same donkey that would later elect other Democrat presidents like Lyndon B. Johnson. He was appointed. Bill Clinton, President Obama, and President Biden. So that same party here, right? That same party. That one had these white-only primaries. Well, this black man was trying to vote, and he was denied the right to vote. Long story short, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can't do that. The primary election is an extremely important process because it is a way for you and I, a little sidetrack note here real quick. The primaries is the process for which you and I, as voters, we get to determine the direction of that political party through its primary. Right? We'll talk more in depth about primaries, I promise, later. But just note that is the process for which we go through in order to pick the direction, more right, more left, keep it steady in the center. It's a process for which we steer the political parties in one way or the other. So just note that for you. Literacy test. So wait, let me backtrack. So So white only primaries were struck down with Smith v. Albright in 1944. Just want to make sure I made that clear. So literacy tests. These were tests that required the prospective voter in some states to be able to read a passage of text and answer questions about it. This is often used as a way to disenfranchise racial or ethnic minorities, right? So you had to prove that you could read, you could prove that you could write. And guess who got to determine whether or not you successfully proved your ability to do that? You see where this is going. These literacy tests, while they were used in southern states, they were not used here much in Texas. That's an interesting note. Understanding tests are very similar to those literacy tests. Very similar. They were tests requiring the respective voters in some states to be able to explain the meaning of a passage of text or to answer questions related to citizenship. This was often used as a way to disenfranchise black voters. So understanding tests, very similar to literacy tests. Okay, they were a way to provide. They were a barrier that people had to go jump through in order to exercise their right to vote. And these understanding tests were aimed directly at black voters. So we also had the poll tax. Right? A poll tax was an annual tax imposed by some states before a person was allowed to vote. Now, we've looked at we've seen some legislation that was passed, particularly those black codes and the Jim Crow laws that absolutely violated civil rights, specifically the civil rights of blacks and other ethnic minorities. We've seen that. And we've seen some progress that was made. Affirmative action, the Civil Rights Acts, but we're still not there, right? Well, the poll tax, what's interesting about the poll tax is two thoughts here real quick. Number one is that you had to pay in order to exercise your right to vote. And the passage and ratification of the 24th Amendment abolished this practice. Which actually brings up an interesting conversation today. Do voter ID laws, right? When you go vote, you have to present your state issue ID in order for you to vote. Now, some argue that just simply asking for your state identification is a form of a poll tax. Because that ID card is not free. Like your Texas driver's license, that's not free. You have to pay for that. So being that it requires money to get this ID, and I can't vote unless I have that ID, is that a form of a poll tax? Now, on the surface, it may seem that way. Others on the other side would argue, well, no, there are other ways you can vote. You don't have to have your state issue ID. You can use your electric bill, a bank statement that has your name and your address on it, right? So, but still, nevertheless, it's a good conversation to have. Is it? Is it a form of a poll tax? And have you thought about it in that way before? It's a good conversation. Anyways, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned all remaining measures used to discriminate against voters on the basis of skin color. Okay, so what we've seen here, okay, are these Jim Crow laws that were passed at the state level, and the federal government were passing these acts as a way to circumvent is not the word to use, but as a mechanism to overturn these state laws. This was a mechanism that was used to overturn, to undo these state laws that were violating civil rights, right? So that's what we need to note here. And remember, it's built into the U.S. Constitution, right? It's built into the U.S. Constitution that if there is a conflict, it's called the National Supremacy Clause. If there's a conflict between state and federal law will always supersede. Always, right? So these Civil Rights Acts was a mechanism to undo the violations at the state level by making it a federal, by passing this constitutional amendment and passing these civil rights legislation at the national level. You were undoing these violations at the state level. Because remember that National Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Anyways. So, our record. So, we've seen so far with black codes and with Jim Crow laws and with the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, we've had some ups and downs, right? Our history is filled with ups and downs. While we have violated the civil rights of others, we've also progressed, meaning that we have tried to undo that, right? That we've tried to respect civil rights. So our history has its abuses, but progress has been made to respect the civil rights of all people. Now, I want to take a moment here real quick to say this, that simply identifying what was wrong, that what we have done, to identify the abuses that the American government has levied against portions of our population, this is not somehow anti-American. In fact, if it's anything, it's pretty American. We complain, politically speaking, and it's built into our DNA. When we were upset with the British, we protested. When we were upset with the government in any way, we protest. We let them know what we're thinking, right? This is built deep into our DNA. So, identifying what we have done wrong, that is not somehow anti-American or somehow unpatriotic. In order to truly appreciate who we are today, we must understand our good that we have done, the bad that we have done, and the ugly that we have done. To appreciate who we are today, we have to know our good, our bad, and our ugly. We have to. So, simply by identifying what we have done wrong, by identifying these abuses that we have levied, that the government has levied upon populations of portions of our population, that is not unpatriotic. Right? Give you an example. If I had a cut on my hand, hypothetically, if I had a cut on my hand, and I said, "Hey, that looks like a pretty bad cut." Right? Let's say I was cutting up a watermelon and I accidentally cut myself with a knife. But that looks like a pretty bad cut. Now, is that me somehow am I demeaning myself? Am I disrespecting myself for saying, "Hey, there's a problem there. That's a pretty bad cut"? Am I somehow demeaning myself? Disrespecting myself? No, right? Absolutely not. That's pretty much how we should view this, right? Simply identifying what we have done wrong. What the United States, when I say we, remember, the government is of the people, for the people, by the people. So when I say we, I'm referring to the government, right? So simply identifying what the government has done wrong is not anti-American. It's not, So I just want to say that up front because sometimes I get the impression that if we criticize the government, if we somehow identify what we've done, that somehow this is unpatriotic. And I would say, no, it's not. Just like I'm not disrespecting myself if I see a cut and I go, that's a pretty bad cut. What am I going to do about that? Right? That said, right, so our history has its ups and its downs. We've had abuses of civil rights. We've seen some of those. We're going to take a look at some more here in just a moment. And progress has been made to respect the civil rights of all people. That said, let's talk about our record. So Native Americans, federal government broke so many of its treaties made with the tribes. Now, I want to make a comment here. Treaties. These are an official agreement between the U.S. government and the tribes. And the U.S. government broke so many of them, either by loopholes that were built into it, or outright, flat out, no, we didn't sign that, even though they did. Outright rejection of these treaties. Now, these were official treaties made, again, like I said, between the U.S. government through Congress and the tribes. And the federal government outright ignored these. Simply that put. So obviously, we do know that Native Americans, they were not treated equally under the law. Right? The 12 Tiers was the name given to the forced migration of the Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma in 1838 and through 1839. So some scholars would argue that the 12 Tiers, that this was a genocide. Others would argue it's a ethnic cleansing, right? So genocide, there's a matter of intent. It is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a group of people. Some scholars would argue that yes, 12 Tiers was in fact an act of genocide to destroy in whole or in part the Native Americans. Others would argue that it was a ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is mostly is defined as rendering an area ethnically homogeneous, or making it ethnic homogeneous. So, what do you think? Did the U.S. government intend to destroy in whole or in part Cherokees that were being forcefully, against their will, migrated from Georgia to Oklahoma? Was this genocide? So was this genocide or was this ethnic cleansing? Right? Was their intent to destroy the Native Americans, or was it simply the U.S. government wanted to make Georgia ethnically homogeneous? What do you think? What says you? Asian Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. So in other words, let's break this down. So in other words, the U.S. Congress, let me say that again. The U.S. Congress passed a law that suspended all Chinese immigration and in fact made Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization. So Chinese immigrants could not become legal citizens. And that ability was denied. That ability was taken away. They literally could not do it because it was illegal too. Right? FDR's controversial executive order 9066, right? So this was an executive order. So as America was thrusted into World War II by the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt, you may recall this, signed an executive order 1966, 2 weeks after the attack. The controversial executive order authorized the U.S. military to remove individuals of interest from military areas. Okay, as a direct result of the order, the U.S. military declared the entire West Coast a military area. By June 1942, well over 100,000 Japanese Americans were relocated to remote internment camps scattered across the United States as their loyalties were questioned. Okay? So, this executive order 9066 signed into law. It was an executive order that FDR signed, which gave way to the absolute stripping away of Japanese Americans' civil rights. We did not treat them equally under the law. Okay, this was controversial because while we use the word internment camps, we use it for a good reason, right? But let's be clear what we're talking about. The reason why we use internment camps is because the correct word to use is concentration camps. But if I say concentration camps, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? That's right, Adolf Hitler, World War II, the Holocaust, right? So these camps, these internment camps that we had, they were not designed to kill. They were not death camps like Auschwitz or Sobibor or Treblinka. Okay, they were not death camps. But nevertheless, they did violate the civil rights of Japanese Americans. They were horrific in that context. The U.S. government, as a way to pass some security measures, right? We violated the civil rights of Japanese Americans. So yes, these camps, they were not, let me say that again, they were not designed to kill, but they were designed to strip away people of their rights. And that's not right, right? So I just want to make sure that we understand that what this executive order did, and understand that these internment camps, they were not death camps. They were not. But they still were horrific because they stripped away the rights of individuals. Okay. The recent violent attacks against Asian American communities that we've seen here recently, is there equal treatment under the law? Or do we honestly see that here? Now, these attacks that we've seen, they have been of individuals. They're not of the government. But how does the government respond? How should the government respond? Do they respond in a significant, sufficient way, as they would of crimes against white people, against black people, against Hispanics? Do we see equal treatment? It's a good question. Gender equality. We see the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, which protected women's right to vote. Now I want to make an observation here real quick, okay? Women did not have the right to vote until the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment established what's known as universal suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. That's what suffrage is. Okay, so we see the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which protected women's right to vote. We should note that we observe the 100th year anniversary of women's guaranteed protection of the right to vote in the 2020 election. While that is cool, and it is, and we should celebrate that, absolutely. What I find a little puzzling here, right, is that it took a constitutional amendment, let that sink in, a constitutional amendment added to the U.S. Constitution to protect and guarantee women's right to vote. Progress. But you see where I'm going with this thought, right? It's this idea that awesome, good, but we still got a lot, but only 100 years ago, which was obviously not within my lifetime, but you get what I'm trying to get at, right? In the grand scheme of things, to look back on how old the United States is, women have only been guaranteed the right to vote since 1920. That's what I'm trying to get at. Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, the proposed amendment to the Constitution that would have prohibited all discrimination based upon sex. The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, this is a proposed amendment. This hasn't been passed, but this is a law that is trying to the advocates for this they're making the assertion that this will end a lot of the discrimination based upon gender. So we need to add the ERA to the U.S. Constitution. All right. Comparable worth. This is a doctrine calling for the same pay for workers whose job require the same level of education, responsibility, training, or working. So there's this idea here, right? The idea that women are not being paid the same as men. What do you think about that? Right? There are scholars who would argue that in a certain field, right, that since it's deemed as a woman's field, that pay is lower, not only for women but also for men, simply because it's deemed as a field dominated by women. Should that be the case? Number one, and number two, does gender play any role in how much someone should get paid? I mean, does it serve any purpose? Should we even have that? Should it truly be just simply and honestly a level of education, a level of experience, and the amount of responsibility? So, comparable worth. There's this doctrine is calling for equal pay, right? This equal treatment. Do we see that today? Do we see equal treatment regarding compensation? It's a good discussion. Continuing on with gender equality, this glass ceiling. You probably have heard this a couple of times, right? Glass ceiling. It's an invisible barrier caused by discrimination that prevents women from rising to the highest levels of an organization, including corporations, governments, academic institutions, religious organizations, etc. Even in Hollywood, right? You could probably tell there's a Marvel Venom poster behind me. I'm a big Marvel fan, and a couple years ago, I can't remember the year, but when Captain Marvel was released, there was a debate not only among movie fans, but also of the fan base. There was this debate that could a woman-led superhero movie, would it make money? And would it be successful? Would it be entertaining? Would the public want to consume that? Would the public want to go see that? And so there is this glass ceiling, even in Hollywood, even within comic book movies, that the glass ceiling is exactly that, this invisible barrier that's used as discrimination against women. So that's interesting to know here. Right? Title IX, this section of the U.S., pretty sure that's Title IX. My Roman numerals, y'all, I'm not good at. But I'm pretty sure this is Title IX. It's a section of the U.S. Education Amendments of 1972 that prohibits discrimination in education on the basis of sex. We also have a record of, let's talk about this, about disabled. Okay, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This was a law passed by the U.S. Congress, signed into law by President George H.W. Bush back in 1990, that prohibits discrimination in employment based on disability. So if you or I have a disability, we cannot be discriminated against in the hiring process simply because we have that disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act is also referred to as the ADA. Right? The American, it's an acronym, but the ADA. This also requires that the ADA requires that we have accessibility to buildings. All government buildings must be up to code that allows, that has elevators if it's a second story floor, ramps for wheelchairs, etc. The ADA requires under law that all government buildings have those accommodations. The ADA also requires employers to make reasonable accommodations to workers who need them. So your job, any job for that matter, an employer must give accommodations to those with disabilities. Right? This is a requirement given to employers from the ADA. Same-sex marriages. Harberfeld v. Hodges, this is the 2015 Supreme Court case, that ruled that states must allow same-sex couples to marry, which is a question for you and I. Do you agree with that decision? What's your thoughts about same-sex marriages? Some argue that this should be a state issue, that let the states decide this particular issue. Others would argue, well, now hold up, it shouldn't be a state issue because it should be uniformed. What if my job requires me to fly or requires me to move to a state that views my marriage as wrong, right? So there's this idea that we need to make it uniform. Like I said, there's others on the other side that would argue it's a state right. Then there's a third argument that government should just stay out of this. But that this is no place for the government. Let the individual make their own decision. Right? So it's what do you think? What says you? Like I said, it's a good discussion. But same-sex marriages were protected. The Supreme Court ruled that states must allow them in 2015. Now, I want to take a moment real quick to introduce this next topic of eugenics. Now, this is so I normally introduce this with asking a question. Okay, so let's play this quick game real fast. All right? So this is a quote here. Now I want you to give some thought here. I want you to think, who said this? Who said this? Right? Birth control is nothing more or less than a facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit and of preventing the birth of defectives. Who said that? I'll give you a second. Right? Who do you think said that? Well, if your answer was Margaret Sanger, you're absolutely correct. It's the Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood. Now, she was trying to push for birth control, okay, and she tied up birth control into the movement of eugenics that was taken off at her time as a way to get more support for birth control. But nevertheless, this is a quote that she said. Here's a second quote, and this one's a little bit longer, but let's see if we can't figure out who said this. I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding, and when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized and feeble-minded persons forbidden to leave offspring behind them. The emphasis should be laid on getting desirable people to breed. This one's a little bit longer, but who do you think said this? I give you a hint. They were a U.S. president. In fact, they were the 26th U.S. president. And that is, yes, Theodore Roosevelt. President Roosevelt said this. Now, one last quote for you real fast. Anyone who sees and paints a sky green and fields blue ought to be sterilized. Who do you think said this? I give you a hint. They declared war on us. Adolf Hitler. What do all three of these quotes have in common? Why are we playing this game? Why are we looking at these quotes? In short, to introduce this next topic of eugenics, because that's what they all have in common. So let's dive into this. Eugenics was a movement in the United States in the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries. Okay, the idea that child bringing among white people without disabilities and discourage it among those with physical or intellectual disabilities. So the idea here is to create a perfect race, a perfect people through breeding. If you don't have any flaws in your genetics, that you can create this superior society. This may sound familiar to you if you're familiar with World War II and the Nazi ideology, because that was basically the thing, was this idea of the Aryan race, that you can through pure blood, through genetics, you can create this master race. And that's what eugenics, the practicing of eugenics does. It's this twisted thought that you can create this perfect group of people through breeding. Right? So a perfect race through breeding. That's what eugenics is. And the United States toyed with this practice of eugenics. In North Carolina is regarded as having one of the most aggressive eugenics programs in the United States. It operated from 1929 to 1974, despite most states ending their programs following World War II. It should be noted here that again, to re-emphasize this thought, okay, after we witnessed the horrors, after we saw the application of eugenics in Nazi Germany, most states here in the United States that had eugenics programs on the books abandoned them because they saw what happened. They saw what this ideology leads down towards. Okay, but North Carolina kept it until 1974. That's what's interesting to note here. In total, more than 7,600 North Carolinians were sterilized. A majority of them were African Americans. Equal treatment under the law. Remember, that's what we're talking about. Civil rights is equal treatment under the law. And with these eugenics programs aimed at creating this superior group of people, no, we see violations here. Eugenics in Texas. We flirted with the idea of eugenics in Texas. We had the federal family examinations. These were held in Dallas, Texas. These were basically contests of which family had the better genes. These federal family examinations. This was held in Dallas, Texas. Now, here in Houston, we have what were known as better baby contests. These were contests of which baby had the best genes. Right? Texas, we flirted with eugenics, but because of our consent laws are so strong here in Texas, we have very robust consent laws. Eugenics, we did not have sterilization programs like we saw in North Carolina. We don't have those here. We didn't have them then, and we don't have them now. Our consent laws are too strong. That prevented these from happening. Here in Texas, Buck v. Bell. This was a U.S. Supreme Court case of 1927. Carrie Buck was a feeble-minded woman who was committed to a state mental institution in Virginia. A Virginian law at the time allowed for sexual sterilization of inmates of institutions to promote the, quote, health of the patient and the welfare of society. Well, the question that faced the U.S. Supreme Court, did the Virginia statute, that is this law that Virginia had on its books that authorized the sterilization, deny Buck the right to due process of the law and the equal protection of the laws by the 14th Amendment? So this was a Supreme Court case that went up to the Supreme Court, and when they heard this, well, I'm going to let the justice. Let's hear from the majority opinion here. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in his majority opinion, so they denied Buck's rights. They allowed the state of Virginia, in the end, that Virginia statute stand, and it was allowed to continue on. And Justice Holmes Jr. here said, and I quote, "It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination," this is the idea that forced vaccinations, "is broad enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes." Jacobson v. Massachusetts. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This is what This is what Justice said that was sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court. I want that to sink in. these are comments from the opinion of this case that the Supreme Court ruled. These are their words. We've had our ups and we've had our downs. We've seen legislation passed at the state level. We've seen that were absolutely horrific, who violated the civil rights. We've seen laws or executive orders, I should say, no, laws and executive orders passed at the federal level that were egregious, that violated the civil rights of others. And now we see the Supreme Court violating the civil rights of people. We need to keep in mind what our politicians, what our elected officials, what our candidates, what our nominees, what our Supreme Court nominees, what they think, what they advocate for, what they deem to be appropriate. We need to know so that when they rule, we are not blindsided, we're not surprised, we're not taken back by an opinion for which they have that we never asked a question about. See where I'm going with this? Buck v. Bell. This is one of the black stains. This is one of those stains on the U.S. Supreme Court. That's my opinion. We see the violation here, and it's just so blatant. Like we've seen with the other egregious violations of the civil rights of Asian Americans, of blacks, of other minorities, of the Native Americans. Okay, we have a bad record. That's not to say that our record is only bad. We've seen some good, right? And we're talking a little bit more, but just bear with me here. Okay. Buck v. Bell today, the decision still stands, meaning the Supreme Court's decision has not been overturned. States have passed legislation against laws similar to Buck v. Bell. So states have taken it upon themselves to correct this mistake, to correct forced sterilizations. And just to be clear, I didn't mention this earlier, and I should have. My apologies for that. But let's just be clear what we're talking about. Forced sterilization. This is the idea that your right to reproduce, your right to procreate, is taken away from you by the state. Let's just be clear what we're referring to. So, in other words, your ability to have a child is taken away from you without your consent. States, though, just to be clear again, states have passed laws that go against, that fight against that idea, that ensures that we don't have a situation like Buck again. So that's interesting to note. Some struggles that we still have today, right? Black Lives Matter. This is we have seen throughout U.S. history that yes, the civil rights of blacks have been violated, right? And when you've seen time and time and time again, generation upon generation upon generation of not being treated equally, well, you can understand that the most American thing to do is to protest. Now, we need to make this distinction, right? Regardless, when we talk about protesting, there is a difference between protesting and rioting. Protesting is a good and healthy thing, regardless if we agree with whoever is protesting, whether it's BLM or whether it's conservatives or Republicans, regardless of who and why they are protesting. Protesting is a healthy thing that we do to tell the government that we're unhappy, tell the government that we are upset, that you need to change, you need to act. Rioting, on the other hand, crosses the line of political advocacy to political violence. We should never resort to that. We should always protest when we have a cause. We should always let our legislators, whether they're at the local, whether they are at the state or national level, we should let them know what we think, regardless of what we're talking about, regardless if it's civil rights, regardless if it's civil liberties, whatever the issue is, whatever it is, we should be upfront with our elected officials with what we think. So we can understand, right, that if we're unhappy with the situation, we protest. Anyone would. Again, this is built deep within U.S. American, U.S. politics. This is deep. This is deep within our DNA. Right? We have violence aimed at Asian Americans. These are struggles we're still having today. Human trafficking, pregnancy discrimination, family separations at the border. These are issues that we're still struggling with today. Right? A quick comment here about family separations at the border, because we're running out of time here. But just want to make a couple of quick comments here. That we need to remember, we have to remember that crossing the border illegally, whether it's at the southern border or the northern border, regardless of what it is, crossing that border illegally is a misdemeanor. Yes, that's right. It is the same level of crime, crossing the border illegally, as it is not coming to a complete stop at a stop sign. It's the same level of crime as going 10 miles over the posted speed limit, which we never speed, right? We don't do that. We obey the law. I can't say it with a straight face. But you see where I'm going with this, right? Crossing the border illegally is the same offense as speeding. So is it just? It is the punishment of separating families for a misdemeanor crime, for crossing the border illegally. Is that just? Let me put it another way. Is it just to separate kids from their family for going 10 miles over the posted speed limit? Because that's what we're talking about. That's the same level of crime. Does the punishment fit the crime? So, the answer, for me at least, no. No, it does not. So how do we... The zero tolerance policy that was passed under the Trump administration, that was aimed at somehow preventing illegal immigration, right? The illegal crossings of the border. That was its intent. The result was these family separations, right? It was almost like it was trying to act as a deterrent. Don't do this. Do not commit this crime. Otherwise, this action will be taken, right? But the end result, though, are family separations. How do we balance humanity, right? How do we balance? Because let's be very, very clear here, okay? These are people fleeing situations. I don't fully understand the circumstances, so I'm not going to cast judgment of any kind. But what I'm getting at is these are people. How do we strike the balance between human dignity and U.S. security? How do we strike that balance? Because it's difficult. This is difficult. How do we do that? So the idea that I'm trying to get at here is that we got a lot more work to do. We have a history of ups and downs. We've done some good, we've done some bad, and we've done some ugly. But that means there's more room for improvement. That means there's more things for us to do. That means there's more for us to discuss, to debate, and ultimately decide. Right? So let's end this lecture, because we're at the end here. And let's end it by acknowledging we have some good, we have some bad, and we have some ugly. And we got some work to do. That said, if you guys have any questions for me, any comments, or if anything didn't make sense, please feel free to reach out to me via email. That being said, we'll catch you in the next video.